You know, it's a curious thing. We live in an age where everyone is trying to be heard. Every mind is a transmitter, broadcasting endlessly into the void, and the void, in its generosity, echoes back with likes, hearts, and little blue check marks. The result is a magnificent chorus of noise, a billion opinions humming at once, each one declaring itself the truth, each one trembling with the fear of being ignored. But have you noticed, the louder the world becomes, the less we truly listen. We've mistaken vibration for meaning, chatter for conversation, and movement for life. Our cities, our feeds, our very thoughts have become so saturated with signals that silence now feels almost offensive, as if something's gone wrong when nothing is happening. People wake in the morning and the first thing they reach for is the tiny glowing shrine beside the bed. It's a remarkable altar, a device that contains the entire world, but mostly it contains the world's confusion. Before our feet even touch the ground, we have entered a marketplace of consciousness where attention is the only currency and everyone is both merchant and customer. Now, there's nothing inherently evil about this. It's just what life does. It proliferates, it multiplies, it talks to itself. But there's a strange forgetfulness that creeps in when you're always surrounded by noise. You start to believe that if you stop speaking, you'll disappear. That if you stop producing, you'll be forgotten. And so the modern person is haunted by the feeling that to pause is to die. We go on manufacturing busyness, the way a tree produces leaves, except the tree does not imagine it must prove its worth. It doesn't schedule its blooming or worry whether the other trees approve. It simply is. But we are the anxious universe. Doubting its own rhythm, convinced that existence must be justified by performance, and that is the beginning of the war. Not a war of nations, nor of armies, but a quiet, invisible conflict that takes place in the space between your thoughts, the war for your consciousness. The world today does not want your wisdom. It wants your attention. It doesn't care what you know, only that you look, that you click, that you feed the great algorithmic appetite which grows stronger with every flicker of your curiosity. And you must understand, attention is not a small thing. It is your life force. Wherever you place it, the universe comes alive in that direction. So when you scatter your awareness across 1,000 little screens, what you lose is not time, but presence. You become like a candle whose flame is pulled by every gust of wind until it burns unevenly and begins to waver. But the truth, my friends, is that no one took your peace from you. You gave it away in exchange for stimulation. You volunteered for distraction. You sold your awareness to the highest bidder of novelty. And the tragedy is that you didn't even notice the transaction because it was disguised as entertainment. Yet, amid all this racket, there still comes, if you are very quiet for a moment, a faint whisper underneath the static. It says, "You are not the noise. You are the silence that hears it." This is the beginning of awakening to see that the chaos outside is a mirror of the confusion within. The problem isn't that the world is noisy. It's that we have forgotten the part of ourselves that is perfectly still, perfectly at ease, perfectly unbothered by the circus of existence. And so, before we can reclaim our consciousness, before we can see through the illusion of control, we must first recognize where we've been spending our attention. Because whatever captures it owns us for a while. And if you don't decide what deserves your awareness, someone else will. The first act of freedom, therefore, is not rebellion, nor renunciation, but recognition. To look at the noise of the world and say, "Ah, yes, I see what you are. You are not my enemy. You are simply my reflection when I have forgotten to rest." From that moment of seeing, the war begins to dissolve. For no battle can survive the light of awareness. And when the noise no longer disturbs you, you begin to hear the music hidden within it, the hum of being itself, the rhythm that never stopped playing. You see, the strange thing about this modern world is that what used to be called the soul has now been renamed engagement. The priests have changed robes. They wear lab coats and design dashboards. They count not prayers but clicks. And the new confessionals are our comment sections, where people pour out their anxieties in public, hoping that an invisible algorithm will absolve them through visibility. But the truth is far simpler and far older. Your attention is your life. Whatever you give it to grows. Whatever you ignore fades. You may think you're merely checking your phone, but what you're really doing is offering a sacrifice at the altar of distraction. You are feeding the machine your most precious resource, awareness itself. Now, there's a marvelous paradox here. For though we imagine attention to be small, a spotlight moving across a stage, it is in fact the whole theater. The universe is aware of itself through the tiny opening that you call your mind. When you look at a flower, the flower is, for that moment, the very center of existence. All of creation has conspired to be aware of itself as that bloom. So, when your attention is scattered, you become a fragmented universe, a galaxy of unfinished moments. And this, you see, is the true poverty of our age. Not a lack of money, but a famine of attention. We are rich in experiences and poor in presence. Now, the merchants of modern life have realized this quite brilliantly. They discovered that if you can distract a man, you can direct him. You need not control his body, you need only occupy his mind. That is why every voice cries out to you, look here, believe this, fear that, because each claim on your attention is a small act of possession. And you, mistaking this noise for choice, begin to live reactively, a marionette, dancing to invisible strings of stimulus and reward. Alan Watts might have chuckled here and said, you are under the impression you are the thinker of your thoughts. But really, thoughts think themselves, and most of them aren't even yours. That's what makes you so easy to sell to. The mind, restless by nature, hungers for novelty. It is terrified of the ordinary. But life itself is ordinary, gloriously, divinely ordinary. The sun rises, you breathe, clouds move, and yet you look for meaning in headlines and hashtags. So you run about trying to make sure you're informed as though wisdom were a matter of volume. But awareness does not come from quantity, it comes from quality. One conscious breath is worth more than 1,000 opinions. And the game, of course, is self-perpetuating. The more attention you surrender, the more hollow you feel. The more hollow you feel, the more stimulation you seek. And so the wheel spins, a golden hamster wheel, gilded with convenience and endless updates. Yet, if you ever stop to wonder, you might notice something rather amusing. You never really decided to play. You simply woke up one morning already running. But don't take this as condemnation. There is no villain here. The machinery is simply doing what machinery does, repeating patterns, optimizing engagement, chasing efficiency. It is our task to remember that we are not machines. We are not meant to be efficient. We are meant to be alive. To be alive is to waste time beautifully, to sit by a river and let it speak without purpose, to gaze at a stranger and see yourself. You can't monetize that, you see. And that's precisely why it's sacred. When you begin to understand this, the power of attention returns to you. You stop living as a reaction and begin to live as a response. You no longer say, what should I look at? But rather, what deserves to be seen? And slowly, the invisible war begins to lose its hold, because no system can manipulate a person who is simply present. Presence has no handle to grab onto. It cannot be targeted, tracked, or sold. It just is. So reclaim your awareness, not by fleeing the world, but by noticing it. The moment you observe your own distraction, you've already taken the first step out of the trance. You have turned the light of consciousness back upon itself, and that, my friends, is the beginning of freedom. For the one who knows how to pay attention is wealthier than all the empires of noise combined. You see, once your attention is captured, the next question the world asks is, who are you? And at that moment, the trap is set. Because the moment you try to answer, the moment you start building the image of me, you step into the costume that the game requires you to wear. You become the product. From the day you were old enough to recognize your name, you were handed a mask and told, this is you. Wear it carefully. And you did. You decorated it with beliefs, credentials, and preferences. You said, I am this, not that. I am right, not wrong. I am for this, against that. And every time you defined yourself, you shrank a little bit more. You became easier to measure, easier to predict, easier to sell to. The ego is a marvelous invention, a necessary illusion. It's the map that helps you navigate the terrain of the world. But the trouble begins when you mistake the map for the territory. When you think you are the mask, you forget the vast face behind it. Alan Watts used to say, the ego is nothing other than the symbol of yourself in the game of life, the role you're playing. And, oh, how seriously we've come to play it. We defend our roles as though the play itself depended on them. But tell me, have you ever seen an actor try so hard to believe that he's the character that he forgets it's a play? That's what the ego does. It forgets that its whole purpose was to pretend. Now, once you believe that this I is a separate little entity, an island floating in a hostile sea, you immediately become vulnerable, because the world can now offer you what it claims you lack. You're not beautiful enough, says the ad. You're not successful enough, says the algorithm. You're not enlightened enough, says the self-help guru. And like a fish nibbling at shiny bait, you bite. But do you see the trick? The moment you believe yourself to be incomplete, you hand over your power to anyone who promises completion. The ego is the salesman's dream customer, endlessly insecure, eternally hungry, willing to pay any price for validation. And yet, what the ego seeks can never satisfy it. It's like trying to fill a sieve with water. The more you pour in, the more it leaks. Because the sense of I is itself a whole, a marvelous whole, through which the universe looks at itself. If only you could laugh at that, instead of trying to plug it. Now, I'm not saying you should destroy your ego. That's just the ego's final disguise, pretending to be the saint who has slain himself. No, the point is not to conquer the self, but to see through it, to realize that I and mine are convenient fictions, tools of navigation, not the substance of being. The moment you see this, even dimly, a great lightness enters the heart. You don't have to defend opinions like fortresses. You don't have to prove your worth in every argument. You can simply be fluid, responsive, unthreatened, because behind the shifting mask of personality, there's something that cannot be offended, cannot be flattered, cannot be sold to. That something is awareness itself, the open sky in which clouds of identity come and go. And here's the secret. The whole war for your consciousness depends on your forgetting that open sky. Advertisers, ideologues, and influencers all sell you stories about yourself. If you stop believing in that story, the war ends, because no one can manipulate what has no fixed form. You can't bribe a cloud or frighten the wind. So, the next time you feel attacked, judged, or enticed, pause for a moment. Notice who it is that feels those things. Is it really you? Or just another thought dressed up as you? The moment you see the distinction, the spell breaks. And in that quiet recognition, the ego, that clever little trickster, bows, smiles, and dissolves into laughter. For it knows Finally, that it was never the enemy, only the mask through which the infinite forgot and remembered itself again. Now, once you understand the game of the ego, the next question becomes, who is playing it and why? How does this strange, invisible machinery manage to keep billions of human beings moving in rhythm, all chasing the same mirages, all afraid of the same shadows? You see, control is never imposed merely by force. It is woven from suggestion, from stories, so subtle that you never think to question them. The real masters of control do not chain your body. They shape your perception of what freedom looks like. They whisper to you through headlines and slogans, through numbers that claim to measure happiness, through constant reminders that you are not yet enough. And the tragedy is not that someone is pulling the strings. The tragedy is that the strings are made of your own desire. The machine runs on wanting. It feeds on the endless hum of more. More followers, more certainty, more pleasure, more control. And every time you say, if I could only have that, then I'd be free, the gears turn once more, smiling. But it's all quite absurd, isn't it? For the more we try to master life, the more enslaved we become to our mastery. We invent devices to save time, and then fill that time with hurry. We create networks to connect, and then feel more isolated than ever. We worship efficiency and lose the art of being. It's rather like watching a man chase his own shadow. The faster he runs, the further it runs ahead. And all the while, he never thinks to stop and see that the shadow was never separate from him at all. Now, I don't mean to paint a picture of villains sitting in high towers, plotting humanity's confusion. That would be giving the illusion far too much credit. No, the system is not personal. It's mechanical, automatic, impersonal. It's simply what happens when consciousness forgets itself. When awareness becomes hypnotized by the very patterns it has created. Alan Watts once said, the more you struggle to control things, the more you lose control. It's the same in meditation. The moment you try to quiet your mind, you create the noise of effort. You can't make the wind still by holding your breath. So it is with society. The more it tries to perfect itself through control, the more anxious it becomes. And yet, notice something beautiful here. The machine has no power over awareness itself. It can manipulate the contents of consciousness, but never consciousness. It can sell you images, but it cannot touch the space in which those images appear. The secret of liberation, then, is astonishingly simple. Don't fight the mechanism. See it, watch it move, hum, and seduce, and it loses its spell. When you observe the pattern, you are no longer trapped within it. You become the witness rather than the prisoner. It's like suddenly realizing that the noise of the city is only sound waves in the air. The city hasn't invaded your mind. You simply mistook its echo for your identity. So, the next time you feel that tightening, that anxious need to fix the world, pause. The need to control is the very thing that binds you. And the moment you let go, the moment you allow things to unfold, even for a breath, you discover something profound. The world doesn't need you to manage it. The sun keeps rising without your supervision. Your heart beats without your permission. The galaxies spin without your understanding. And in that realization, the whole structure of control begins to crumble. You see that the same intelligence which moves the stars moves you, and that you, poor anxious creature, were never separate from it. The only control worth having is the graceful control of a dancer, a control that comes from surrender, not resistance. And so, paradoxically, the way to master life is to stop trying to master it. Let it move through you, as wind through reeds. Then, you'll find the machinery loses its grip, not because it's gone, but because you've remembered it was never outside of you to begin with. Now, when you see that control only tightens the knot, the next question arises naturally. What happens if I stop fighting altogether? And here is where life begins to play a new tune. Because the moment you cease to resist the flow of events, something extraordinary occurs. The flow begins to carry you. You see, we've been taught since childhood that the way to live is to push. Push towards success. Push away failure. Push through the pain. Push for enlightenment. And so, quite innocently, we make of life a wrestling match with itself. But life is not an opponent. It's a current. You can no more fight it than a fish can fight the sea. Alan Watts loved to remind us that water is the most powerful thing, precisely because it never resists. It yields to every obstacle and, by yielding, wears mountains away. It flows around what it cannot move and, in time, moves what it cannot resist. That is the Tao, the effortless intelligence of existence. The trouble is, the ego hears non-resistance and thinks it means defeat. It imagines lying down in passivity while the world tramples over you. But that's not it at all. To practice non-resistance is not to collapse, it is to relax into reality. It is to realize that your will is not separate from the will of the universe, and that when you stop pulling against the tide, you discover that the tide has been moving in your direction all along. Think for a moment of breathing. When you inhale, you do not seize the air by force. You open to it. When you exhale, you do not throw the air away. You release it. In the same way, non-resistance is the art of breathing with life, letting experience enter and leave without clinging or pushing away. You suffer not because of what happens, but because you refuse to let it happen. Now, you might say, but if I don't resist, I'll lose myself. But that is precisely what must occur, the loss of the false self that imagines it is in control. What you lose is only the armor, the tension, the story. What remains is something infinitely freer, a sense of movement without mover, action without actor. You discover that life lives itself through you, and all the while you had been straining to do what was already being done. Non-resistance is not a technique, it's recognition. It is seeing that struggle is unnecessary, because what you're struggling against is only yourself. The river doesn't need permission to flow. The wind doesn't need a goal, and neither do you. There comes a moment, sometimes after years of striving, when the mind grows tired of its own warfare. In that exhaustion, you may simply sigh, "Oh well." And in that sigh, that tiny act of surrender, a vast door opens. You realize that letting go isn't something you do, it's what happens when you stop holding on. That's why every spiritual tradition, in its own language, whispers the same truth. Be still and know, yield, and you shall overcome. Die before you die. It all means the same thing. Stop pushing the river. It already knows where to go. And when you begin to live in this spirit, something subtle shifts. The world no longer feels hostile or chaotic. It feels rhythmic, playful, intimate, like music. You no longer dance at life. You dance with it. And because you're not fighting the beat, you move with perfect grace. That is the art of non-resistance. Not a moral commandment, but an alignment with what has always been true. That you and the flow are not two. When you surrender, you don't lose control. You regain reality. You know, once you stop trying to swim upstream, a marvelous thing happens. You begin to float. And as you float, you suddenly realize this was never a test. It was a game all along. Life, you see, isn't a grim assignment handed down from the cosmos. It's a performance, a divine game of hide and seek, where the universe forgets itself in order to rediscover itself through you. You are not here to win. You are here to play. But the trouble began when we forgot that. Somewhere along the way, humanity decided that the game must have a score, and whoever keeps it highest must be right, rich, holy, or happy. We invented seriousness. And in doing so, we turned the dance into a march, the song into a strategy. You can watch this anywhere, at the office, in politics, even in religion. Everyone is busy proving themselves, trying to get somewhere, trying to become someone. The game of becoming, you see, is endless, because once you become what you wanted to be, you immediately see someone else who seems slightly more. So you run faster, you meditate harder, you compete to be enlightened, which is the silliest game of all. The more seriously you chase peace, the further peace runs away, giggling behind the next self-improvement course. Now, there's nothing wrong with goals. The problem is when you forget they are part of the play. Think of a child building a sandcastle. She pours her whole heart into it, shaping towers, digging moats, decorating the walls with shells. But when the tide comes in, she doesn't weep or curse the sea. She laughs, perhaps squeals, and begins another. That, my friends, is wisdom. To build fully and yet hold lightly. To give your all while knowing it all passes. Alan Watts once said, "We thought of life as a journey with a serious purpose at the end, heaven, nirvana, success. But life is not a journey. It's more like music. You don't dance to get to the end of the song. You dance because dancing is the point. When you forget this, your movement stiffens. You start counting steps, measuring progress, judging rhythm. But when you remember that you were never meant to arrive anywhere, your whole being relaxes. You find yourself laughing more, forgiving more, noticing how sunlight lands on a wall, or how wind tugs gently at your sleeve. Play, you see, is sacred. It's not childish. It's divine. Because only those who truly trust existence can afford to play. The anxious must plan. The fearful must strategize. But the free they dance. And this is the real meaning of non-resistance we just spoke of. To return to play is to trust the rhythm. You stop trying to choreograph existence, and instead, you let existence dance you. You don't lead the waltz. You are the waltz. And when you can live like that, light-footed, curious, unguarded, you begin to see that everything is play. The successes, the failures, the heartbreaks, the triumphs. The universe is not testing you, it's teasing you. It's saying, can you enjoy the ride even when you don't know the destination? Most people think enlightenment is a kind of escape from the game. But it isn't. It's remembering that it was a game all along, and playing it beautifully. The awakened person still laughs, still stumbles, still pays taxes and spills tea, but they know it's all part of the dance, and that changes everything. Because when you see life as play, even the hard parts become part of the melody. You stop demanding that the music be happy all the time. You let the minor notes ring. You begin to trust that the song knows what it's doing. So relax. Laugh at the seriousness of your own seriousness. The universe is smiling through your eyes, pretending to be busy, pretending to be lost, just to see how long it will take before you remember that you were never anywhere but here, already home, already whole, already part of the cosmic play. That is the return to play. It's the rediscovery that to be alive is not a duty, it's a delight. Now, once you rediscover the play, a most peculiar thing happens. You begin to notice the silence between the notes. And that, you see, is where the real music lives. Silence is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of listening. It is the space in which the symphony of existence unfolds. And yet, in our modern rush to fill every corner of consciousness, we've forgotten how to hear it. We mistake silence for emptiness, as though stillness were a void rather than the womb of all creation. You see, you cannot hear a melody without silence between the notes. You cannot read a sentence without the spaces between the words. Without emptiness, nothing can appear. The same is true of life itself. Every experience arises out of stillness and returns to it, like a wave rising from and falling back into the sea. But we, the restless players, are afraid of that sea. We fear that if the music stops, we will vanish. So we fill the silence with chatter, plans, commentary, noise. We rush to tell the world we exist, not realizing that our very being is most radiant when we are quietly aware. Alan Watts often said, "Muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone." When you stop stirring the mind, the silt of thought settles, and suddenly the depth of your being becomes visible. You don't have to make clarity, you only have to stop agitating it. And in that stopping, the ecology of silence reveals itself. Silence, you see, is not barren, it's alive. It hums with potential, with intelligence. It listens for you even when you're not listening for it. It is the open field in which every possibility grows. When you sit quietly, without trying to meditate or achieve some exalted state, you begin to notice the world breathing with you. The wind moves, the heart beats, distant voices fade into birdsong, and beneath it all there is this vast, unbroken awareness that holds everything gently. That awareness, that is what you truly are. In silence, you remember. You remember that life was never asking for your constant commentary. The tree doesn't need your opinion to grow. The sky doesn't need your analysis to be blue. The river doesn't wait for your consent to flow. All of it carries on effortlessly, just as you could if only you stopped long enough to notice. And this is what I mean by the ecology of silence. It is the natural order of balance returning. When you fall still, life begins to recalibrate itself around you. The nervous system softens, the heart steadies, the senses sharpen. You begin to see how each sound belongs exactly where it is, how even noise has its place in the great composition. You might discover that silence was never something you enter, it's something you uncover. It was here before the words began, and it will remain long after they fade. It is the backdrop of every joy, every grief, every moment. And when you tune into it, you stop feeling like a separate player and realize you are the pause that allows the music to exist at all. When you learn to rest in that space, not as a technique, but as a way of being, you realize something utterly simple. There is nothing to fix, nothing to chase, nothing missing. The world is already whole, and so are you. That is the power of silence. It doesn't demand, it doesn't persuade. It simply is. And in its gentle presence, everything false grows quiet too. Once you have tasted silence, something unexpected begins to bloom, compassion. Not the sentimental sort that trembles at every sorrow, but a deeper seeing that every being, every clumsy, frightened, striving creature is doing the best it can with the dream it believes is real. You see, once you recognize the machinery of control, once you see the dance of the ego and the chaos of noise, it's tempting to sneer, to judge, to condemn, to think, I see the illusion, and the rest are blind. But the moment that thought arises, the ego has returned wearing holy robes. You've made enlightenment into superiority. And that, my friends, is just another mask in the costume trunk of self. True awakening doesn't make you separate from others, it makes you incapable of believing in separation. When you see that the same consciousness that looks through your eyes is looking through every other pair, how could you hate anyone? Even their ignorance is your own, wearing another disguise. Alan Watts once said, "You are that vast thing that you see far, far off, with great telescopes." He meant that the stars and the eyes that watch them are one motion of being. And if that's so, then every cruelty, every greed, every confusion is also part of that one dance. To despise it is to despise your own hand because it's still learning how to draw. So compassion becomes a kind of holy defiance. While the world wages its invisible wars for attention and dominance, you quietly refuse to join. You don't fight noise with noise, anger with anger, propaganda with counter-propaganda. You simply listen. And in that listening, you transmit something far more subversive than outrage peace. It's an odd thing, but gentleness is the greatest revolution, because the whole structure of manipulation relies on fear. It needs you to react, to harden, to choose sides, to define enemies. But when you meet even the manipulator with understanding, when you see their fear and do not return it, the chain of reaction snaps. In that instant, control loses its foothold. This doesn't mean you approve of harm or injustice. It means you recognize that violence cannot heal itself. That shouting at the storm does not calm the wind. Instead, you embody the calm. You stand in the center of the whirlwind, unprovoked, untensed, and from that stillness your actions arise, not from ideology but from intelligence, spontaneous, appropriate, unforced. You see, compassion is not weakness. It is clarity dressed in kindness. It's the realization that you can't purify the world by hatred any more than you can wash mud with mud. Only water, quiet, flexible, patient, can do that. When you look at another person and see beyond the mask, something marvelous occurs. You begin to forgive yourself, because you realize that all the mistakes you've condemned in them are reflections of your own learning. And suddenly, you don't need to be perfect anymore. You only need to be present. That is why love, not the sentimental love that demands return, but the quiet recognition that we share the same being, is the most radical act in a divided world. It dismantles control without resistance. It ends conflict without victory. It dissolves fear without force. To love, in the deepest sense, is to stop pretending that you are different from anything or anyone. It's to see that the light shining through the eyes of your so-called enemy is the same light that shines through yours. And when that seeing becomes steady, the world around you changes. Not because you've changed others, but because you've stopped making them other. Then every encounter becomes an echo of yourself returning home. That is compassion as defiance, the refusal to forget our shared nature, even when everything around us screams for division. It is not the end of action. It is the end of hostility within action. And from that peace, every gesture, every word becomes a kind of blessing. And so, my friends, after all the noise and the striving, after the long campaign to protect and prove and perfect yourself, you come to a strange realization: there was never a war. You see, all along, it was the mind fighting its own reflection. The enemy it feared was never outside. It was its own misunderstanding the dream that it was a separate creature, flung into a hostile world, scrambling to survive. But when that dream fades, even for a moment, you laugh, because you see that the battlefield was made of smoke. You were firing thoughts at clouds and wondering why you felt tired. The world does not need saving from itself. It needs remembering the noise and the silence, the chaos and the calm, the ego and the awareness. They are not two forces. They are the inhalation and exhalation of the same breath. And when you see this, something deep inside relaxes. You stop holding life at arm's length. You stop demanding that it make sense before you love it. You stop pretending that there was ever anything to win. Alan Watts used to say, "You and I are as continuous with the universe as a wave is with the ocean." If that's true, then all your struggles were simply the sea, learning how to ripple. The tension, the seeking, the confusion, they were not mistakes, they were motions of awakening. So the end of the war is not a victory, it's a homecoming. It's when you finally understand that peace was never waiting for you at the end of effort. It was the quiet background of every effort you ever made. When you stop fighting the current, you don't sink, you float. When you stop defending the self, you don't vanish, you expand. And when you stop trying to control life, you discover that life has been effortlessly carrying you from the beginning. You were never the soldier. You were the sky through which the battle passed. You were never the thinker. You were the space in which thoughts appeared and disappeared. You were never the seeker. You were what was being sought. And so, as the war dissolves, the simplest things begin to glow again. The taste of water, the sound of birds, the warmth of a hand, each becomes unspeakably complete. You see the divine not as something distant or holy, but as the ordinary itself, shining quietly in every corner. Nothing has changed, and yet everything is different. Because now, you no longer look at the world through the eyes of a frightened fragment. You look as the whole. You look as life itself, awake to its own wonder. And when you live from that place, you find that even confusion, even sorrow, has its beauty. For nothing is wasted in this vast unfolding, not even your forgetting. So the war ends not with triumph, but with laughter, the laughter of the ocean, realizing it was never separate from the wave, the laughter of the dreamer waking and finding that everything, even the nightmare, was made of light. When that laughter comes, softly, silently, you understand that there was never anything to fear, nothing to fix, nowhere to go. There is only this, the living, breathing miracle of being. And in that awareness, the war is over. It never really began.